Okay. I think we can. So how many participants? Shall we start now, Johnny? Yes. Or are we still at meeting? All right. I think we can start now. We have a good number of participants here. All right. So welcome to the second session of the Policy Dialogue Series this year. This dialogue series is co-organized by the Department of Asian and Policy Study and the Academy of Hong Kong Studies of the Education University of Hong Kong, together with the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Throughout this academic year, Professor Anthony Cheung, members of both universities, as well as former Secretary for Transport and Housing, and Professor Tylot Lui, Chair Professors of Hong Kong Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong, will discuss critical issues in Hong Kong's political, economic, and social development. In addition, each time we invite a prominent figure in the field to join and enrich our discussion. We hope that these dialogues will contribute to a deeper appreciation of the complexity of the issues that we are facing collectively and stimulate exchanges of ideas both within and outside academia. I'm Shirley, acting head of the Department of Asian and Policy Study. I will be the moderator of today's discussion. Professor Wu from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology is now on a business trip, and so I'm taking up his role today. Today we will talk about the relationship between development and environmental protection. All of us would agree that we need to protect the environment, but when it comes to the price that we will need to pay for it, people seem to have different views. So joining Professor Anthony Cheung and Professor Lui today is Professor Christine No, who is the Chief Development Strategy for Hong Kong University of Science and Technology's Institute for the Environment. She was a former Undersecretary for the Environment and also legislator. She has been teaching a course at UCLA's Business School on non-market risk, and she sits on several for-profit and non-profit boards that all relate to different aspects of the environment. I'm sure with her input, there will be a vibrant discussion today. So without further ado, I would invite the three speakers to each deliver a 20 to 25 minutes presentation. This will be followed by a roundtable discussion. Other participants, please do feel free to send out questions or comments in the chat room. We will try to address them in the Q&A session. So maybe I invite Professor Anthony Cheung to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvio, for your introduction. Now, let me share with the audience my PowerPoint. I think you've all got it. The topic of this morning seems to be rather provocative. Are we being forced to make a choice between development and environment? We face all kinds of conflicts, dilemma. Are these irreconcilable? So that is the topic we are going to discuss today. As the first speaker, I will try to locate a setting as well as identify some critical issues. Ideally, development is a process that creates growth, progress, positive change in environmental, economic, social, and demographic component without damaging the resources of the environment. And we often talk about sustainable development. Sustainability is to be manifested within the overall developmental thinking. So in an ideal situation, the two should be rather complementary, and we could actually have both development and environment within the overall notion of sustainable development. In welfare economics, we have the notion of Pareto optimum. In other words, a point whereby some will gain, but none will lose out. But in the real world, this kind of optimal point seems rather rare. So in terms of development in Hong Kong, particularly housing development, which is of a great concern to the community over the last several years, I think we face all kinds of controversies and contentions between development in the broad terms and also environmental conservation. Now, let's look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals promulgated by the UN. We are not going into the detail, but you can see from this slide that, in fact, there are all kinds of good things that we try to achieve under those SDGs. And as far as some development projects are concerned, we can, for example, see that SDG number 8 relates to economic growth. So obviously you need some activities, development projects that can facilitate economic growth. Number 11 regarding sustainable cities and communities. Housing clearly is part of that kind of situation. So for sustainable development, it's not just about ecological aspects of our society, our world, but also other aspects of human well-being. So let's look at the situation we often face. Among the SDGs, there exist tensions and conflicts in practice because of diverse interests, power, priorities, so on and so forth. And all those 17 Sustainable Development Goals involve debates, decisions. Nobody would dispute the need to protect the ecological environment and achieve sustainable development. But at the same time, at least in the case of Hong Kong, there have been growing social and economic demands for more housing, more schools, more spacious schools, hospitals, transport, and various built infrastructures. Housing is #1 social problem in Hong Kong. And when I was Secretary for Transport Housing some years ago, I often tried to impress whatever audience I was facing. I said, only 7% of Hong Kong's land is used for residential development. If we can just get another 1%, then the quantum jump would be quite significant. We could have more affordable homes, we could have more spacious apartments. But why has it been so difficult to get the extra 1%? So we are talking 1%, another 1% of Hong Kong's land. But that is a great challenge. So the kind of housing challenge we are facing could be described as the 1% question. Now, housing cannot just be apartments, housing units. We need transport, we need all kinds of community facilities, public utilities, other infrastructures. They have to come with housing, and they all involve planning and environmental challenges in various ways. So those challenges, you could argue, are unavoidable. But how do we handle those challenges? Will those challenges create insurmountable hurdles which make it so difficult to get more housing? I'm not suggesting that Hong Kong is unique in facing those challenges. In fact, many other societies, countries, regions face similar challenges. But of course, the context may well be slightly different. My view is developing livable communities is an important sustainability goal, as what the UN SDGs also show. A city with inadequate and least affordable housing cannot be considered sustainable. Now, Hong Kong, among big cities, has the ranked first in terms of unaffordable housing. Housing involves the use of land. So the question is whether land use in Hong Kong is fair and efficient. Efficient in terms of maximizing the space that could be created by land, plot ratio, for example, is one of the indicators. Fair in terms of different purposes, competing demands, competing needs for the use of land. But land use is politics. Whether we are talking about land resumption, reclamation, using areas within greenbelt zones or at the fringe of country parks for housing development remain highly controversial. Every now and then, we try to have a consensus in the community. And in the last administration under Mrs. Carrie Lam, a task force was set up to find land on land supply. The 2018 task force spent somewhat like 1.5 years to reach a report. But the question is, had that task force really established a consensus? In other words, do we now have a consensus since that 2018 task force so that we can move forward? I would suggest that the reality is slightly different. We are still debating every now and then on various options. So balancing development and environment is a challenge. It often involves a trade-off, but I think it should not be a zero-sum game. On land use and housing, let me just give you a sense of the kind of trade-off we are talking about. The title of this article from Forbes in October 2017 is about the myth of the land-constrained city. It's not describing Hong Kong, it's about other cities worldwide. So every city will feel that it doesn't have enough land. It is land constrained. So the argument in this article by Scott Baer was, even if a city is geographically constrained, it can tear down low intensity uses and build higher buildings, higher houses, apartments. Constraints against new housing are political, not geographical. So the point is, geographically, you can do a lot of things. Of course, whether those things are acceptable from various angles, environmental, economic, social perspectives, in terms of land use politics, that's a separate issue, but it's not just geographical. An urban economist, Richard Florida, argued in 2016 that affordability, he was talking about housing actually, affordability was a matter of being an expensive, AN, versus expensive city, EM. So it's a choice between whether you want to have more versus having more costly housing, a more costly, expensive city. Coming back to Hong Kong, we have been facing challenges in various aspects. We have to make a hard choice. We face all kinds of hard choices. In the history of Hong Kong's development of new towns, often we tried to have comprehensive development projects in the new territories. And comprehensive development involves large-scale land resumption and clearance, compensation, whether how to deal with objections, extensive planning approvals and reviews. And nowadays, reviews includes a lot of areas: environmental impact assessment, EIA, traffic impact assessment, and various other assessments. In terms of large-scale public housing development, for example, at one point, when we counted the number of assessments, it went to over 20 different impact assessments. So negotiations, compensation is a standard feature of the process. Also, separate processes are required for other necessary infrastructure projects, including transport, sewage, and other public utilities, as well as some community facilities. So we should not underestimate the complexity of comprehensive development. At the same time, there is rising local community NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And again, that is not unique to Hong Kong, it's a worldwide thing in other cities as well. I remember once when I was receiving, when I was secretary, when I was receiving another minister from, I think it was either Sweden or Norway. So we are talking about the lack of land in Hong Kong. And I told him, well, we had all these difficulties. And then guess how that minister responded? And he said, oh, even Hong Kong has such problem. In other words, in his country, I thought the Scandinavian countries, they should have more land. There should be less opposition to whatever planning suggestions regarding land use. But it seems that they also face resistance in terms of land use. Now, nowadays, public engagement and local consultations are standard practice in terms of securing support, consent, consensus to land use. But I find that increasingly, these activities, instead of narrowing differences, instead of achieving some kind of consensus, actually amplify the differences. So that whether or not you do engagement and consultations, the end product may not be so different. Now, I'm not disputing the need to have public engagement, but I'm trying to question, are we getting a productive outcome through such engagement facilities, activities? If not, is it because we are not doing engagement and consultations properly, or whether the society, the context has changed? Now, at the end of the day, despite all these consultation, engagement activities, if there's still a great hurdle, a lot of obstructions, is government justified to take tough actions? When taking tough actions, how can the public be sure the government is taking the right decision? I mean, biting the bullet is difficult, but whether or not you are really achieving something by biting the bullet, is there a convincing narrative? So that is something I think we need to look at. Reclamation, again, in terms of Hong Kong's past history of development, we relied some on reclamation as well. Around 6% of Hong Kong's total area is reclaimed land. But when we look at Singapore, because now these days people like to compare Hong Kong with Singapore, some 1/4 of Singapore's total ground area is reclaimed. So is it because of that degree of reclamation that Singapore can afford more spacious housing, a greater supply of housing to young people? Why can't Hong Kong secure more land through reclamation? Now, there are all kinds of objections from the green lobbies, from the community on ecological grounds. Can those objections be overcome? Can we achieve a balance? Can we balance the needs of marine ecology, for example, and human habitat? Using country park fringe areas is a controversial issue in Hong Kong. Now let's look at some figures. Out of a total of more than 1,100 square meters of Hong Kong's land, about 3/4 is countryside. Country parks and special areas cover a total area of 443 square meters, about 40% of the total land area. So the point is, when we face a long waiting list for public housing, when we have more than 100,000 households living in SDUs, subdivided units, another forms of inadequate accommodation, can we still try not to touch country park areas? When there are competing needs, whose needs should come first? Or maybe it's not just such a simple arithmetic problem. Again, should there be an overall review of land use in Hong Kong, including country parks? But of course, any government facing a situation will be very reluctant to open a can of worms because you expect controversies, divisive politics. Very quickly about some views in the community, which I would say somewhat like myths. The first one, reclamation is not necessary. There's already enough land for more housing. Brownfield land, agricultural land in private hands. So the blame is on government. Government doesn't have the will to proceed with statutory resumption. But I think the reality is more complicated than that. First of all, just using brownfield and agricultural land may not be sufficient. So you may still need to look at other options, including reclamation. But just resuming brownfield doesn't mean that the process is easier, because it's also subject to the same planning process. You have objections, you need to be provisioned brownfield operations, clearance takes time, compensation, negotiation. So we are not facing an alternative, an easier option compared to reclamation. Of course, reclamation is more costly, takes even more time. Small house policy, Ding Mok in the New Territories, often is regarded as the culprit of land shortage. But if you look at the figures, actually over a decade, I'm using 2008 to 17 as a compare for illustrative purpose. On average, less than 1,000 small house approvals was granted. So actually, even if we could use those small houses as supply to housing, it doesn't solve a problem because we need a lot more. And in any case, land suitable for small house applications may not be suitable for large-scale residential development. And normally, in those around those areas, we do not have the relevant utilities such as sewage or surfacing roads. Now, the Fanling Golf Club is a controversy. I just use that as an illustration, as symbolic of the debate of the kind of conflict that we have, whether or not we can touch the golf club. Some will say you cannot touch it because it's old trees, conservation value, and then the venue is very important for international tournament. But then there are other arguments, counter arguments. Can part of the golf club be redeveloped? Not the whole area, but part of it. Can some old trees be relocated? Can a new ground for international tournament be reprovisioned somewhere else on Lantau Island within the country park area there? How do we balance competing needs? I mean, users of the golf club compared to those living in subdivided units and on public housing waiting list. There may not be a very straightforward answer, but there are all kinds of questions that we need to look at. No pain, no gain. So ultimately, it's about balancing. In the near to medium term, we have to utilize all kinds of options. We have to press ahead on all fronts because land supply and planning approval take a long time. So we cannot afford to be complacent. We cannot afford to wait. We have to secure as much developable land as possible and face up the trade-offs. No option should be let off easily. The planning standards and procedures may well need to be reviewed and streamlined so as to enhance developability. And we need better planning so that there is an improved home-job balance within those areas to be developed, and to reduce cross-district commuting, which is inducing the demand for more transport infrastructures. And remember, all transport infrastructures, transport facilities may also lead to environmental concerns, carbon emission, for example. In the long term, public housing as priority seems to be what Hong Kong should be looking at, some kind of quasi-Singapore version. People here in Hong Kong admire the housing provision in Singapore, but what about land supply? Can conservation come with development? Green building, landscaping, space making, energy saving, low emission? How do we manage conflicts, tensions, and competing demands? The key word is managing. We need to get out of the binary mindset. One-sided developmentalism versus environmental fundamentalism. But when there is a real conflict, government must decide on the priority needs. They envision a sustainable development strategy, but just putting that strategy on paper is not sufficient. Government has to tell a persuasive story. So both vision and the narrative are needed. Now, as people here in Hong Kong recently like to compare Hong Kong with Singapore, so let's very quickly see what Singapore has been trying to do. Over the last decade, Singapore has been selling this story of a garden city. So a city that is active in development, but also doing well in environmental conservation. In last year, Singapore promulgated the Green Plan 2030. Now, I'm not here to go into the details of what Singapore is doing, but you can see from the 5 points here that Singapore is trying to convince Singaporeans and the world that as a city, it is trying to have to create green, livable, and sustainable homes. Sustainable living, green economy, a climate resilience, resilient future, and so on and so forth. But even in Singapore, there are comments that, in fact, the conflict between economic development and sustainability is there. It's a dilemma that is not easy to solve, even for places like Singapore. So it involves, again, a trade-off that has to be considered by the government, and government has to take the lead in helping the community to accept that kind of trade-off. Finally, this is my final slide. Last year, the former chief executive, Mrs. Carrie Lam, promulgated the Northern Metropolis Development Strategy. Now, of course, this is just a proposal. A lot of fine details have to be worked out. The selling point of the Northern Metropolis development is not just about housing, but also to help Hong Kong to secure a second engine of economic growth, and then collaboration with Shenzhen. So there are other strategic objectives. But in the report itself, the government accepted that in the past, even in terms of developing new towns, not enough was done about the home employment balance, and also about cross-district commuting and other things. So the antagonism between ecological conservation and urban development was also accepted. And in the area earmarked for the Northern Metropolis, that kind of contention, conflict, tensions, certainly we need to be dealt with. The document advocates a new town planning approach. So what is meant by this new town planning approach? More affordable homes, public housing, for example, more job opportunities, so less conflict between home and employment, more schools, hospitals, other facilities, use of smart methods, better ecological conservation, and then a second major economic engine of growth. Now, all these are desirable outcomes. So the question then is, how can the so-called new town planning approach facilitate the achievement of these nice things? Again, a balancing act. So in the new context now in Hong Kong, are we able to make a better, a more effective balancing act? So that is the question I'm posing to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. May I now invite Professor Lui to deliver his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Siu. I think among the three speakers here today, I'm the person who is least familiar with environmental issues. So quite honestly, today I'm not speaking as a researcher on relevant topics or this area of discussion. I'm responding more as an ordinary citizen living in Hong Kong, of course, also concerned about the environment, and raise a couple of questions. Probably some of you would think that, this is very commonsensical, probably simple-minded, but at the same time, I do think that quite a lot of people share some of my views, and thinking that, if we really want to move forward, we have to go beyond this kind of discourse of development versus environment. I don't think that it would be a very productive discourse for future policies. So I'd like to start off with this issue. It's borrowing from the title of a book, actually written by Colin Crouch, what I would call the strange non-death of the development versus environment discourse. Is quite honestly, long time ago, I would have thought that this is a topic that is just for secondary school debates, and we have long gone beyond that, and we know we shouldn't come back to it because it was once a contentious topic in the context where perhaps a lot of developing countries at that time were undergoing rapid economic development, and so you say that, okay, we do a little bit of trade-off, and we need to set priorities and so on. And also at one point of time, a lot of government would think that, okay, we can just leave some of these so-called environmental outcomes a little bit aside for the moment. There would be new technology coming up, so everything would be dealt with later on with advanced technology. So there are mechanisms, but not now. So don't worry. So we just put it aside. The other perspective at one point of time was, of course, that okay, we are creating rubbish and we're creating a lot of negative outcomes, but well, of course, no one would put it in their own mouth, but they would think that, okay, we can secretly dump them somewhere. Some of those countries would take care of them, and so we would not suffer. And so as a result of that, people think that okay, we can move on with this kind of development versus environment discussion. But increasingly, I think since the 1980s, actually, from Chernobyl, from all these sometimes disasters, sometimes accidents, sometimes various outcomes of projects, that we become increasingly aware that the older views are not quite true, because all these so-called negative outcomes about the environment would come back on us, instead of just thinking that they would be left elsewhere, and we don't need to worry about, probably something would happen 200 years later, but we'll all be dead by then. Increasingly, we notice that it's coming back right on us, and the system cannot be contained simply by having a kind of faith that new technology would comes up, and so that you don't really need to worry anything. So in fact, environmental outcomes are increasingly close to us, and I don't think that nowadays we can still continue to say that, climate change is only a conspiracy theory, so, it's rubbish. Sustainability, of course, is important, but it's only secondary. So again, we will come back to this call of development priority and so on. I do think that, we have already come to a stage that we are aware that actually all these problems are real, and then you can't escape from them. And so theoretically, the relevance of this development versus environment discourse should diminish. But yet, again and again, it comes back and still shaking our policy discussion. I would tend to think that this is rather unfortunate, because we're still sort of falling into the trap of is an either or question, that you what will you choose first and what will come later. And as a result of that, we create this kind of policy straw person, well, old words with straw man, that you just knock it down, and so that you think that you put forward a brilliant idea, so that you have to accommodate development, environment. You can discuss it later and so on. I do think that these are very unproductive framework and won't take us forward. And in fact, I would have thought that we have long moved to another level of discussion. For example, probably we should focus more on effectiveness of regulations and measures, because we have new technology, we have new measures, we have new expectations coming in. So we should have moved forward. I mean, as I said, as an ordinary citizen, sometimes I just look at this issue and think that, why can't we just borrow from the experience that we have in dealing with issues as simple as accessibility? I mean, to be honest, I must confess that at one point of time, maybe 30 years ago, when the issue about accessibility comes up, and you think that, okay, should we spend so much money on having an elevator just because we need to make sure that everyone can use that facilities? But later on, of course, you recognize that, of course, this is very, very important, because if you don't have that, then some people really can't use certain things. It's human rights. It's as simple as being caring and so on. So actually, in the process, we increasingly would put something to embed them in our planning process, the way that we conceive projects. So, of course, I do understand that nowadays the idea about sustainability is all over the place. People do take them aboard, but have we done enough to embed this requirement, I would think, in every single level, every single area, when we talk about development, environment, social growth, everything? And I do echo Anthony's point that, Northern Metropolis Development Initiative may be a good test case. Because when we look back at some of the planning experience that we have in Hong Kong, of course, we have done a marvelous job. But at the same time, I think we do need to recognize some of our shortcomings, some of our short-sightedness. For example, I happen to live on Hong Kong Island East, very close to the coastal pathways and so on. So every single evening I can do my brisk walk along the coast, which is marvelous view, great place, and so on. But every single 15 minutes, then we stop somewhere, and then you need to meander a bit, because there were some of the pipes that previously, I think, the government in the old days would think this part of the Victoria Harbour actually doesn't have high opportunity cost, so we can put some facility there. And then later on, you go to another part, and you find that, okay, there's also some other facilities that at one point of time, people would think that, okay, this is not exactly the sort of land that we would use right away, so why don't we just put it there? Every single bits of things like this I would say, exactly cutting corners, because we think that, sometimes we do have what I would call inconvenient facilities. Then as a result of that, you say, okay, we put it aside for a while. We don't think that we don't have that perspective of thinking, hey, we are doing planning. So we are talking about what would happen in the next 30, 50 years. So as a result, the way that you use land and the way you allocate space and so on, you should have that longer perspective about how to make sure that ordinary people can enjoy all these facilities as well as the environment. Same thing about some of those I would call tacit measures. A lot of people would like to say that it would be good to have a new town, not only for residents but also with employment opportunities as well. Quite honestly, I think that is a very challenging question. It's not easy at all. It's very difficult to match the people you're going to, they're going to live in that area and the type of job relevant to them. It's challenging, but at least we need to think about it. And again, as an ordinary citizen, I would just think about, okay, can we plan a community in the perspective of minimizing carbon emission so that people would not need to travel afar for employment? Of course, you say, it's very difficult to get this done. But if you look back at some of our experience, for example, in Tuen Mun, of course, when we planned Tuen Mun, that would be in the 60s and 70s. And at that time, when we think about job, it's really about manufacturing jobs. So at one point in time, it's really about a lot of public housing, as well as factory space and so on. That would be good enough. But then, of course, Tuen Mun, from day one, is not very successful because people still travel out, even for manufacturing jobs, would go to Chuen Wan because of higher pay and so on and so forth. But later on, in the 80s, why there's a huge demand for transport, public transport, getting out of Tuen Mun, is exactly because increasingly public housing residents, they are actually taking up white-collar jobs. So they need to go back to the city center in order to work. And so as a result of that, the volume of traffic was double the original planned figure. So they need to go out and need to come back and so on. I tend to think that, yes, I understand, societies keep changing, demographic changes and so on. But again, if Northern Metropolis would be a new initiative, then can we have that sort of readiness to think that, right from day one, can we think about all these possibilities? How to make sure that, there would not be redundant public transport trips in and out of a community. How to make sure that, life would be more balanced in terms of simple things like this. I know it's not easy to get it done, but that sort of mindset, I would think, would be important. So again, I think that, what I'm saying probably would be very simple-minded, highly simplistic, maybe sometimes even naive in a way. But I tend to think that, these are all standards. Just like accessibility is a standard. You need to comply, you need to take it as starting point, so that when we talk about a new town, a new urban area, right from day one, you have to think about carbon emission. Right from day one, you need to think about, okay, how to make sure that every single space, we would make sure that they will be properly used. For example, sometimes, again, without knowing too much about it, brownfield, I can see container trucks parking there. At one point in time, I was saying that, okay, this shouldn't be the case. But when I sit back, I was saying, when we do the planning, something like 40 years ago, when we push for the development of the container port, have you ever think about the parking needs of container trucks? Same thing. I do brisk walk every evening. I've seen a lot of, well, not today, but 3 years ago, when we have a lot of inbound tourists, I've seen a lot of, tourist coaches illegally parked in urban areas, simply because I don't think that we actually have enough space for parking coaches. But with the growth of numbers of inbound tourists going up to 58 million from mainland, then that would create a lot of demands for all these transport facilities and so on and so forth. So can we have standard as simple as this? It is perfectly okay for us to do inbound tourism business, but then there are, related services, there are relevant demand for space, land, whatever, that we need to take care of. So a more comprehensive approach to this sort of thing, I tend to think that, it seems to be very, very basic, but well, would this be the right time that we sit back and think more about this, so that, we take all these as standards, as starting points, so that we don't need to go back to the issues about whether we still need to choose between development and environment. I know, as I said repeatedly, this probably would be too simple-minded and so on. Of course, there would be different interest groups, there would be issues about power, there would be people keep arguing about priorities and so on. Inevitably, there will be controversies, there will be debates, there will be disagreement. I mean, as a sociologist, I know all these things perfectly well. Also important is that, of course, for sociologists, we don't really believe in perfect planning, because you can't plan every single thing. But having said that, now we recognize that there's a need to look ahead. There's a requirement of foresight. Then we need to have some sort of more readiness to take all these things on board. It seems like a very redundant message, but I do think that, like what I mentioned about tourism and coaches parking space, just like container port and the parking need of container trucks, just like things like, when you set up certain facilities, there are pipes, there are wires that you need to take care of. All this interconnectedness of different initiatives in different domains, they need to be taken care of. I don't think that we have done good enough in the past, but looking ahead, we need to do that. And we need to have that sort of mindset as well as awareness, so that, as I said, we don't need to go back to that old debate about development and environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Liu. So now we will have our last presentation from Professor Liu, and then after that we will have a discussion. So may I please invite Professor Liu to deliver her presentation, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think there are many interesting issues that have been brought up, but I tend to agree that we're not really talking about a fight between the environment and what development means. So let me just start off with by maybe asking a few more questions. Now, my understanding of Anthony's message is, can there be a new planning approach? Obviously, you lay out many issues and it's not ideal. And you've also talked about whether the northern metropolis could be, whether we can really prove to ourselves that we're capable of doing better, since it's a big and a very, very large plan. Now, what I liked about Dialogue's presentation is the common man, the common intelligent man, who's aware of his surroundings, are sort of saying, hey, I've heard this before, and this debate's not actually very helpful, and haven't really moved on. And how should we look at the issue going forward, right? And I think we all agree, of course it's not easy. Of course there are politics involved. Politics, what does it really mean? It means that there are conflict of interest. Different people want different things. So if you're the government, what role are you going to play? Do you have to actually come forward and present something that is compelling, that at least the majority of the population will go along with you. So I think it'd be just helpful to maybe dispel some of the difficulties that, Anthony, that you brought up, so that it's easier for us to depart from the rhetoric of development versus the environment. So these are three bits to illustrate how the narrative has been going in Hong Kong about those issues. All right, let's look at some pictures, because I think this helps us to understand what kind of terrain we have in Hong Kong. Now, everybody knows where those places are. Flat land has been built on, and actually, Hong Kong is one of those amazing cities where we have built up the mountainside. There is a lot of buildings. Most of them are, in fact, residential places, actually halfway up quite big mountains. This is only possible because of amazing extreme engineering that we've defeated this problem in Hong Kong. But you know, you can't really build too much higher up. I mean, you can, but maybe that's not the answer either. Now, this is just another perspective of looking at Hong Kong. We have extreme density. We have these large mountains, and we have a lot of things on slopes. We talked about reclamation, and Hong Kong is the product of a lot of reclamation. Now, you will see the red areas are where we have reclaimed, and a lot of reclamation are on Hong Kong Island at the edge, right? Because Hong Kong is a big rock, and the reclamation is right at the edge of the harbor. And then on the Kowloon side, you can see where they are, and of course we had to reclaim a lot of land for the new airport. Now, the red circle just on the eastern side of Lantau Island, that's the approximate area of government's idea of doing major reclamation there. And the narrative of why that is necessary is, I would say, threefold, right? One is housing. The other one is, of course, actually beyond housing. We need land for other purposes. And then thirdly, the idea that if we were able to have virgin land, we could create some kind of green, smart, healthy city for the people of Hong Kong. And the notion is, it's impossible to do that in the older areas. So in a new area, we can kind of start again. Now, we can also debate whether this is the proper way of looking at development going forward. This is Singapore. I just want people to understand what we're really talking about. Singapore, you can see the lower land area, a lot has been reclaimed, and they have reclaimed land for their port. Now, our container port at Kwai Chung is right now in the heart of the city. They have moved their port further out through reclamation. Now, I'm going back just to show you what we are talking about. We have been reclaiming around the harbor. So the question of where are we talking about that Hong Kong could reclaim? In Singapore, they are reclaiming out to the South China Sea. There's a huge difference to the topography and the geography of the two places. Now, the green bits that you see, there are no mountains in Singapore. It is called Bukit Timah, and for Hong Kong, that is like a bump. Yeah, compared to Hong Kong, where we have big mountains. So I just want to say that if we want to compare the 25% of reclamation that Singapore could do and the 6% that Hong Kong has reclaimed, you know, like on the basis that let's reclaim more in Hong Kong, well, I think we need to actually have a very careful discussion about where is it that realistically you want to reclaim. Now, I mean, people might remember that I was the one in LegCo that passed that promoted and passed the Protection of the Harbour Ordinance. So within the frame of the Victoria Harbour, well, it's very, very difficult today to do any reclamation. And you see why, because our harbour has actually narrowed substantially. So actually, if we're talking about reclamation of any size where you're going to put housing and other things on it, we really do have to have a good geological and engineering discussion about, well, where are you going to have it? Now, you wouldn't want to think about reclamation before you've also talked about, well, are there any areas of redevelopment? I mean, what else can we do on existing land? So I think this is the major issue going forward. Okay, now I just again wanted to talk about country parks. So the green mountain areas are essentially where our major country parks are. And I think history tells us that the delineation of country parks, the thought of, you know, drawing country park and say, let's protect that by law, one of the driving principles was that these are also our watershed areas. So the issue about green belts, and green belts is not country park. Green belts are on the side of country parks. Now today, if you wanted to use country park land for development of housing, you better be very clear to tell us which bit of the country park you want. Now, we're talking about the fringes of country park. And in my time in government, I think they only found 2 bits where they said, well, these may be suitable because they are relatively near areas that already have some roads and facilities, right? So even when we're talking about reducing maybe the 40% or using other areas that are the green belt, well, again, be very specific about which ones. And I think this notion of, well, you know, we're only, you know, that the notion is there too much country park land? Well, actually, if you look at the map, you'd see those are not the ideal places for public housing. Now, so one of the questions that we didn't have in Hong Kong is, and I couldn't understand why, is if we wanted to use, let's say, bits of green belts, well, actually, shouldn't we have a more comprehensive discussion to say, well, actually, there are areas of high ecological value that we're not protecting well enough yet, right? Mm. And there wasn't always enough funding and so on. There are actually areas that you can extend country parks, right? Because they're still part of the mountainous areas and so on. So can we have a better discussion to say, look, if we look at Hong Kong in total, can we promise that we would allocate resources to protect ecologically valuable areas that we're not doing? I mean, obviously we should do that. Are there areas that we could even include in country parks? You know, then I think you can argue with the Hong Kong people and say, well, actually, there are certain areas that may have been sort of zoned as country parks that could be used for some other things. And there are some green belts that also may be possible. So I think if you don't present a full picture of how you're really using sustainability principles, well, you know, people of course say, no, I don't want you to touch anything. Now, what's the problem with small houses? Well, you know, small houses, it's not particularly, you know, look at how tight they are. The other problem that I have with the structural side, I'm not going to talk about the political side. Okay, let's just talk about the structural side of this isn't good planning. You tell me this is good planning, right? This is not good planning. And people in Hong Kong, because there is such a shortage, you know, are still happy to live in such a tight environment because of a lack of alternative. The other thing is small houses, because they were once envisaged as village housing, not of great density, small houses don't have to comply with today's all the regulations of today. They're simpler. They're meant to be similar. Well, frankly, is that still sustainable? So how do we think about the structural side of small houses? There are complaints that actually, if there was some kind of emergency, you know, like a fire or some other kind of you know, happenings, that you couldn't get fire trucks in, and you know, there are all kinds of problems, right, with this. So I think let's look at small houses from that perspective, which people are not discussing. We just hope that there are no disasters. Okay, about the golf club. If we look at the issue broadly, as I think the three of us have kind of just brought up, you probably wouldn't want to pick up, you know, you wouldn't want to slice off a bit of Hong Kong's golf club. But we have juxtaposed the discussion about Fanling Golf Club as a rich and poor person's debate. You know, we're asking the question to say, well, if we slice off a little bit on the side, the flatter side, you know, by the way, this is on a hill, yes? On the side, maybe we can cram in some housing, so that would be good, right? But actually, it doesn't really solve any of the problems we talked about. You know, so I think the issue is not about the environment. Yes, there are some very, very valuable areas there, and talking about moving them and all of that is also not the right answer. But we're not able to have a full picture of really what the options are. We are told there are no options. And then this debate becomes a rich and poor person debate, which I think is completely unhelpful. Okay, the Northern Metropolis. We all have a lot of wishes that this could then be done with the planning principles and vision to be something much better. Question is, and they're planning it right now, is it going to be quantity-led or is it going to be quality-led? Now, and how do we do that within government where the existing priorities are all the problems that we've talked about? Dialogue, you talk about, well, you know, can we not reimagine this? Because actually Hong Kong people want a lot of quality issues. I think your planning system within the government, the priority of how government works, how they articulate the problems, the straw man that you talked about, Dialogue, right? And the issue, you know, like brownfields, oh, okay, just takes a long time is another headache. And it's all of those headaches that we've put out without adequate solution that we're pushed back into, let's take a slice of Fanling. I mean, you know, it's unbelievable how we are squeezing ourselves down to impossible choices. Now, the other thing is, and I didn't have time this week to actually do a bit more research. Population. I think if we go back 20 or 30 years, and we list out projections for population, you will see that at one time, population was very high, lots of people coming into Hong Kong. And then the population has been dropping because our fertility rate is down, and the difference between the economic opportunities on the mainland and Hong Kong has also changed substantially. So Hong Kong's population, is it going to be as we have envisaged it? So if we also think, and this is a vision, future forward thinking about it, if we think Hong Kong and the GBA, it's going to be fundamentally different because the social economic dynamics have actually improved for everyone. So Hong Kong people, one of the policies today is for younger people to consider working in the GBA, in Shenzhen and in Guangdong. We're also talking about maybe older people can spend, you know, time living across the border. I mean, what are we really envisaging? And if we look at demographics in Hong Kong Island is kind of depopulating, right? Because we can't cram in too much more housing. And we see much more growth in the new territories. And the northern metropolis, in a way, accepts that, that calculation, and that economic activities, maybe not everything, but a lot of economic activities are actually moving towards the border. So again, if we have these kinds of vision coming, how do we plan for the future? Do they offer us exciting opportunities or just more of the same? So now, this is Hong Kong on our side, and that's Shenzhen on the other side. In the northern metropolis, one of the more exciting ideas that government said, we're going to buy up all the private subday, right? These wetlands and fish ponds. The idea is that there could be some kind of giant protected area. Now, how is that going to be planned? Very exciting. For the first time, they've come up with something really exciting. How is that going to be juxtaposed against the hardware development around in the northern metropolis? Now, that is something we haven't heard, but this is quite exciting. Now, the other thing that I find fascinating is this just came out on the 5th of November. I haven't really seen anyone talking about it in Hong Kong. I haven't seen it actively discussed. Just go for the last sentence there. China will promote international exchanges and cooperation to protect bird migration routes passing China and to build an international mangrove center in Shenzhen. That is us. What I'm saying is we are on the other side of Shenzhen. This is about Mai Po, the wetlands and all of that. How's this going to be connected to northern metropolis? How is Shenzhen and Hong Kong, our planning folks, really going to work on this? This is going to happen in Shenzhen. So what are we going to do in Hong Kong? We had mangroves once too. The reason about protecting mangroves is this is going to be one of those bio measures, right? That is going to help with storm surges and so on. So I think our people here on this slide need to kind of see how to do regional planning as well. And this is my last slide. Actually, if we look at the building infrastructure in Hong Kong, if we use current regulation about building upgrade, changing windows, painting exterior, and so on, just imagine us going to 2050 and ask this question. If we just depend on current regulation, what kind of building stock will we have for commercial and residential buildings by 2050, 2060? I think that building stock is not going to be acceptable for a city that would like to envisage itself as a world-class city. Now, with all this discussion today about climate change, about biodiversity, about well-being, smartness, and having to build, right? Having to develop, I would like to see this as something exciting. I would like to see the government consider a 20 to 30 year retrofitting policy for both commercial and non-commercial buildings, particularly, and we're talking about the older ones, right? So we do have an aging building problem in Hong Kong. This is well known amongst the built environment professionals. This is not what I say. We need to imagine how we can create this kind, how to reimagine this kind of building stock. We can't tear everything down. How do we retrofit it? How do we blend in the low carbon? How do we use design and the technology that we know and finance it? There'll be a limit to what you and I as individuals can just bring out of our pocket and say, okay, I'm going to improve on the building where I live in. What we need is We need government, we need the built environment professions in Hong Kong, which is actually very strong. We need our financiers to actually help and discuss together the qualitative improvements that we want in Hong Kong and make it a development opportunity rather than for us to say, oh my God, this is a big problem, and the politics won't allow us to get there, and the conflict of interest will make it impossible to do anything. I just don't accept that. So let's turn the discussion around to something much more positive and exciting. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Liu. So I think Professor Liu has already summarized the views of Professor Cheung and Professor Liu very well and supplement with very useful information to the discussion. So how should we start today? I think it will be productive if we kind of like, build on the discussion that we have already got or the materials that we have already got and try to focus on a number of key issues that were mentioned in different presentations. So to me, I think, and for the topic, environment versus development is a very big one, and it would be more productive if we focus on some more specific issues. So one general perceptions or impression that I have got from all these three presentations is that, there are price that people will probably need to pay when during the process of development of the environmental course, but then these courses or these debate here isn't really that critical in the sense that with better planning the conflict could be resolved. But the problem seems to be that in the past Hong Kong didn't really have that plan in mind. So there were comparisons between Hong Kong and Singapore, which is we can imagine that Singapore has a pretty macro long-term development plan here. But then in Hong Kong, in different presentations, there were criticisms that the planning process seems to be problematic, and then there has to be better planning, better regulations, and etc. And then we talk about the long-term metropolis. So I think the first thing that we can start off with our discussion is really the planning process. And then later on, we will jump into the more specific environmental issues or debate that we have here in Hong Kong, the reclamation, the country part, and the golf course, because they seems to be involving very different dynamics here. But let's talk about the the border discussion, macro perspective, the planning process. Now, I don't know. I definitely wasn't, I'm not very familiar with the policy making process here, but then it seems to me that there, it's all the time, there has been occasionally people coming out and say, we need better planning here in Hong Kong. We need a good discussion about, about the environment, about the development visions here in Hong Kong. And then in different governments, there seems to be initiatives like that as well. All the presenters somehow talk about Carrie Lam's great discussion, the debate about the land use, and then I don't know how you think about that, but then right now we have the discussion about the long-term metropolis, which everyone think that is a great opportunity to again apply the design, the planning, macro planning approach to development. But just for the sake of discussion, may I ask one question, like, okay, given that previous government seems to have already been doing or initiating different sorts of discussion, the public debate, the macro planning process, and it seems to me that today we are still having problems with development. We still seem to I perfectly agree that the small house in the new territories are really very salient issues, examples of how poor planning we have here in Hong Kong. So given that all these previous effort on planning or on macro discussion have already been kind of like done somehow, what were missing here? Or does these failures somehow, to a certain extent, suggest that well, the kind of mentality that we have, the top-down planning model might not be very suitable for Hong Kong. Like we cannot be like Singapore, which you have the long-term planning here, but maybe in the context of Hong Kong, in which different speakers have also mentioned the capacity here. And also one participant in the chat room also mentioned that, well, Hong Kong is a society, is a city within China. And so you have to talk about the national dynamic here, which Professor Lo also mentioned at the end of the presentation. So when we are talking about some kind of very long-term planning, Hong Kong seems to be particularly problematic or particularly weak in that. So I just wonder if all these previous effort or failure or current issues somehow suggest that we do have to rethink about, you know, the feasibility of having the kind of macro planning here for Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have a problem here, because what we lack is, well, maybe I should say, what we do have in Hong Kong are pockets of good stuff, right? So, for example, dialogue, you talked about when you're walking along the harbour front, right, which we've finally kind of started to connect. Now, 10 years ago, people said, well, we can't even walk along the harbour because there are no facilities. Okay, so we've now done that, and there are now just pockets of problems here and there. What this tells us is Hong Kong identifies a certain problem and then fix that little problem. When we fix that little problem, sometimes we actually do it quite well. Then we have actually, again, some really funky and original ideas, like all these unattractive services that you also need land for. Well, let's put them in a mountainside, right? We're now digging into the mountainside. That's fantastic engineering, by the way. It's a unique Hong Kong solution. So we have ideas that actually are quite good. They come from the engineers and the designers within various government departments that are actually quite good at thinking through solutions. What we are unable to do, unlike Singapore, is we raise it to a high government level where we will say things like, we need this kind of housing for our people. Now, the issue about housing in Singapore, which I think on a global basis is one of the best, is that years ago, they've made a decision that people need to live in certain type of publicly built housing, how it's going to be financed, and of a certain size. Well, in Hong Kong, we're going kind of in the reverse, talking about, well, since we can't afford housing, they need to be smaller and smaller. I mean, we're getting to a stage where government is talking about, well, we need regulation to not make it too small. You know, so what I see is the problem is at the highest level, there has been relatively little imagination about how we should live in this city, connecting it with the people so that they seep into all the technical departments within government to produce that. We have in the departments certain newer guidelines about sustainability, bringing in more green and smart and so on. So you see pockets of things that are quite good, but they don't connect at a higher level because we don't have those high level drivers of quality. I wonder what Dialogue and Anthony, what you think?
I agree. I mean, that's exactly, you know, the point that I want to raise in my own presentation is that in the past, I think with very limited resources and so on, somehow we've been juggling and try to work out some so-called smart solutions within a lot of constraints. But that's one of the inadequacy of that sort of approach is that you don't really have a bigger picture. Like, for example, I think, Christine, when you're mentioning about the port development in Singapore, same thing in Hong Kong. I mean, if we really think about Kwai Chung and the port's future, we need to think about whether you require relocation, and then the question would be where, and you know which part, so that you know if you do reclamation, whether that would be acceptable, and whether this would drive further economic growth and so on and so forth. Otherwise, if you're just stuck in that place, you talk about, okay, we do minor things so that we would patch up a bit, and so that, you know, maintain competitiveness for the next 2 years, and so on. It is not going anywhere, not only in terms of economic development, but at the same time, I think the important thing that you just raised is about the quality itself. I do think that we need to have a kind of, like what you said, imagination to emphasize that, you know, okay, we're talking about something 30, 50 years down the road, and what should that be? And so that from the present point of departure, that what sort of pathways, what sort of things that we must do in order to arrive at the desirable outcome in future.
Can I bring up another possible controversy, right? You may remember, actually, the Hong Kong government did at one time have a proposal to move the port to the edge of, to the western edge of Lantau.
Not officially.
Not officially, but it was an idea, right, at the time.
Actually, when I was secretary, I did consider eventually moving the container port. Why? Because when the port was first developed in Kwai Ching, at that time, when we talk about the 1970s, Kwai Ching was rather remote geographically. But now, as Dialogue said, it's quite at the center of activities. So planning-wise, it makes sense to move the container port to elsewhere. And we need reclamation. And then, of course, for the Kwai Ching site, we still need time to decontaminate so that it could be used for development. But on the larger question, I mean, responding to what Christine you have asked, and also the attendee in the chat room. Now, I raised Singapore, not that I think Hong Kong can simply use the Singapore approach. Singapore and Hong Kong, we are different cities. We face different constraints. We are institutionally, constitutionally different. And every city has to find its own solution. The point I raised Singapore is that's how Singapore finds a solution within those constraints, challenges that Singapore faces. So for Hong Kong, how do we face our challenges? I think we should avoid easy answers. Easy answers meaning that, I mean, what the person in the chat room said, well, maybe Hong Kong people moving to Shenzhen, Hong Kong people moving to the mainland.
Well, those are,
that is not the answer.
Well, but we do have one thing that we might want to think about. If we look at Hong Kong as our own little unit, right, then certain things are unthinkable. And so, for example, we wouldn't want to give up on our port and so on and so on. Yeah. But actually, we think of us as the GBA. Now, there is the Singapore solution and also the Shanghai solution, right? So, for example, their container port has been moved out further along. I mean, can we imagine? I'm not suggesting this. I'm just saying as an example, right? As an example of the more kind of imaginative possibility scenarios to play around with as policymakers. Is it possible to conceive of Hong Kong and the Shenzhen, Guangzhou ports, reimagine, right, the container part, that it is rebuilt somewhere else? Because actually, if you look at Guangzhou, they also have the same problem as us. They have valuable port area that could be used for development. So all I'm saying is, if we don't kind of open our minds together with the GBA on certain things, then we might all miss out on certain possibilities. So if we are thinking about plans of people moving residents more easily between Hong Kong and the GBA, old people in Hong Kong being able to live across the border but still have benefits in Hong Kong, what I'm saying is these things are not outside the realms of possibility. But when we are looking at something like the ports, you know, it's the same kind of thinking. But are we brave enough to explore?
No. That still doesn't avoid the key issue. We can relocate the port, let's say by reclamation. So the question is, can we reclaim?
But maybe not within the territory of Hong Kong.
Oh, then you're talking about totally different things.
I am, because this is where we have to go.
That is what people suggested in the past. Why don't we just build public housing in Shenzhen or in other parts of GBA for Hong Kong people? Now, I think if
that
we,
is not what I'm suggesting,
yeah,
because we have a lot of possibility.
But I think that if we just look at solutions that way, we are trying not to face the challenges.
No, I disagree with that.
The challenges is, as what Christine you pointed out, I think it's good to look at the pictures. So your argument earlier was, if we talk about development, actually we have developed quite extensively, moving up the hills. So don't imagine that we have a lot of empty space. Reclamation, yes, certain part can be considered, but we shouldn't take it as a generally available sort of option. We need to be specific. Where? Country parks, yes, we can look again, but certain areas can be considered, but not other areas, not as a sort of easy option. So in other words, we don't have easy options.
We don't have easy options.
So the question is, certain places can be, certain specific solutions can be considered in certain locations, certain means. And in terms of trade-off, it's not just about whether we are willing to pay the price in terms of money, price in terms of opportunity, loss, other alternative uses, but at least that is something physically feasible. But there are options that is physically not feasible. If so, let's forget about them. And then we focus on what is feasible. We try to be specific about the solutions, and we consider whether we can pay the price.
Anthony, I think here, I think Christine has thrown up actually not just one question. Actually, there are two questions. One is touching upon the issues on rescaling our own perspective, because for a long time we still look at Hong Kong as just Hong Kong, not in the broader regional context. But even in the regional context, we can differentiate between regional in terms of Hong Kong in Greater Bay Area. But also, I would tend to think that, we can rescale Hong Kong in the sense that, for example, I once wrote a short piece in Ming Pao saying, okay, if we're conceiving about 明日大嶼, reclamation in Lantau in future, shouldn't we choose a site far more remote rather than that part so close to the city center? Because if you really want to create a new city, probably you should go further away. Of course, that would be very expensive. That would be taking a long time and so on. But the problem is, if you're still staying close to the space between Hong Kong Island and Lantau, you would probably repeat the same story. The city center is still in Victoria Harbour, it's still in Central, it's still in Tsim Sha Tsui, and so on and so forth. So sometimes probably we need to rescale in stretching Hong Kong far more bigger, because you like it or not, since 1997, we have upscaled a lot of things in terms of, say, I mentioned inbound tourism, in terms of a lot of economic activities and so on. So you do need to think about how to expand Hong Kong itself. The other part of the discussion that Christine has raised is saying, hey, look, even if we agree to talk about using some of the green belt or even country park for building, we still need to assess, look at it. This is the part that has least service of public transport. This is not an area for high density living. This is an area for that kind of project. So even if you can use it, what kind of problem are you solving? What sort of solution are you proposing? Are you talking about building a small private project of low density living project? I mean, then you get into the sort of debate about rich and poor again, and it would be unproductive, because that is basically not a desirable option. If not, then like what you said, Anthony, then rule it out, don't talk about it. Focus on issues that we really think that is doable, and it would hit right on the sort of objective or outcome that we think would be important at this moment or in the near future. So there are probably two different levels of issues that we need to think about.
I think that's right. And right now, the KPI for Hong Kong's domestic policy is whether you can build fast enough public housing, right? And there is this idea that if we could solve the public housing problem, then everything would be all right in Hong Kong. People would become happier and so on. Well, I also think that's limiting it. So if public housing, the speed of public housing is the single KPI for the success of Hong Kong's social issue going forward, I just wondered again whether, that's going to frustrate people, because they're going to measure you by, well, what can you do in 2 years? What can you do in 5 years? Oh, you're telling me that this takes 15 years. Well, forget it, right? So we're setting ourselves up for something that might not give all of us a sense of excitement about what the future can bring. And I wonder, the Northern Metropolis, if we use the same kind of planning mindset, what we will end up with is pockets of things that are quite good, but overall it's going to be more of the same.
Well, I'm not that optimistic.
You're even less optimistic.
The Northern Metropolis, because at the moment it is a very sort of sketchy plan. I mean, all the nice things should go into it because we're not happy with what we did in the past. Now, that's a good way of sort of envisioning the future. But then we should not underestimate those constraints and hurdles. So if we ignore those constraints and hurdles and imagine that, well, no matter what we went through in the past, but this new project will definitely solve all the problem, I think we might be simplifying the issues. And I think that is our concern. Now, the real issues are, whatever option we choose, we have its own sort of constraints, people not entirely happy, whether it's reclamation, whether it's rezoning, whether it's comprehensive development, or even our relationship with Shenzhen. I mean, are we sort of duplicating, or are we really complementing each other? So yes, the population, if part of Hong Kong's population becomes more mobile, maybe the whole GBA will provide a larger sort of a spatial or functional opportunity for Hong Kong. But there are still certain limits, because we're talking about two systems. I mean, right now under COVID, it's less easy for people to move across the boundary. So at the end of the day, we have to be very pragmatic. Let's focus on Hong Kong. What kind of options? Yes, theoretically, they may be available, but perhaps physically, they are not feasible.
We need different people, I think, to focus on different ideas, right? I mean, obviously, we have different communities of people here with different interests. So I think if we were, let's say we were in the shipping maritime business, the idea of possibly shifting it somewhere else and what would make commercial sense and create more land for, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, I think they are more competent to at least consider. Now, whether it's politically possible, governments would accept it or not, but they can take on those discussions. So, but if we're talking about Northern Metropolis, there is a connective side to Shenzhen. So what I haven't heard yet is how that is going to be done with Shenzhen. And, even in my little area of the environment, planning the cross-border, the connecting part of the infrastructure, like how are you going to deal with sea level rise, right? How are we going to better connect the forest, and how are we going to better connect the wetlands? Now that Shenzhen is going to have their big plan, what Hong Kong needs to do, these kinds of discussions, how are they taking place? And how do we stretch ourselves so that in doing these things, the outcome, right, the design, planning, and ambition outcome would truly be world-class. It would become a branding opportunity. It would revive a part of our biodiversity, all these elements that the world are looking at to say we need to do this. And I think our young people, that's what they want to see. But we're not creating narratives in that sense that we all get excited. We get pulled back into exactly what you're trying to do today, Anthony, which is to alert us to think about, let's get out of some impossible dialogue.
All right. Thank you very much for. I think that discussion is fascinating. I think it really brought out number of really important issues here. Like, well, when we talk about planning, that seems to be a very complicated process here, involving a lot of incentives, a lot of key different players, and also, well, the scale of the planning. Who should be involved? Are we sticking with the original scale of Hong Kong, or are we going to have a broader imagination? So I think these really bring out some of these really important topics in planning. And yeah, I just want to, because in the chat, in the Q&A box, one participant just mentioned that, well, what about the possibility of crowdsourcing this idea from the society? Do you think that this is something that Hong Kong has been doing, or would it be something that would actually succeed? Or how is your views as very experienced policymakers here? How difficult or how feasible it is to incorporate views from the society in the planning process, so as to.
I think the question here really is that ordinary people in Hong Kong have ideas or have views that they wish to put forward. And how would the government try to capture these? And how can they be made to help government in a way? I mean, government consultation, what are they really about? They're about connecting and engaging the people. Now, the other thing that can be done is government can, of course, gather views. But for those views to then be discussed in an orderly fashion, it's not just popping up questions, right? The government could organize under the sort of, let's say, Northern Metropolis planning kind of ideas, right? It is not impossible to imagine that government organized many discussions with professionals, I mean all the architects and planners and so on. There's a huge community of these people who love to enter into this discussion. What they need is a client, right? i.e. the government or the private sector, a client that allows them to do all these things. Now, their ideas are not so different, I think, from what the public would tell you that they want. More this and more that, less this and less that. And then people can go away, if they are permitted by government, right, to actually use this, that they really become blended into government plans. Because if the two processes are not linked in some ways, then people again get angry to say, you're just wasting my time. How the government wants to do this, and part of the problem within government is sometimes they say it takes too long. It's like speed. Well, but the two things can be designed in a way that you can complete it within a period of time that everybody finds possible. I mean, Singapore has actually tried some of these things with relative success. So I think, but we're not in government, Anthony, so we're just blurbing away for great fun today on this panel.
Yeah, but if I may add a kind of one or two footnotes to what Christine just said. I said, yeah, this is a marvelous idea. I do think that, especially from the professional communities, architects, town planners, I'm sure that they have a lot of ideas and they're very good at creating models and maps and designs, so that, a lot of people would get into a good process of brainstorming and new ideas and so on. But somehow in the process of discussion, I do think that there are two issues that we need to take into account very, very seriously. One is the kind of things that we know it is not doable. For example, repeatedly we have heard of people proposing ideas like, why don't we just build public housing in somewhere in GBA, and then ask the local government to build the railway connect to Hong Kong, and so that Hong Kong people can go in and just live there, spend the evening, in the morning come out and work in Hong Kong and so on. I tend to think that this is a kind of unacceptable idea. I mean, be kind to our neighbors. I mean, why would someone just take care of all your residential problems without getting any benefit from you. It is not a way of collaboration. So if we think about something that in Greater Bay Area, we really need to think about a kind of project that it would be mutually beneficial and so on, so that to make it something doable. It is no longer a context that we think that, I just give you an opportunity to, to take care of 500,000 of our people, it should be your privilege, that kind of thing is long gone. So don't think about the undoable thing. The second thing that I'm interested in raising is that we also need to reflect upon some of the, I may not call it the problem, but some of the issues in previous mode of thinking. For example, in the old days, in the 60s and 70s, the government at that time, when they think about new town and public housing, is easy. You've got to be sent to the remote places because that is the way to develop public housing. You will be the person, to go there, the first batch of people, so that, by moving more of you, there would be demand for services, then gradually life would improve. That's the way. All the locations of all these projects would be, again, places where I have the least opportunity cost. It is a way to resolve an old debate in the old days in Hong Kong, is that, I would not make you becoming a lazy person by providing you with public services. Probably most of us would disagree with that kind of thinking, but it has its own very consistent logic. Whenever they think about such projects, you need to go somewhere else, not a lot of services, you need to spend 5 tough years, and then gradually the community would mature. Nowadays, we're talking about 2022. Nowadays, we're talking about probably we should have expectations about quality as well. That probably would require a new mode of thinking. When we accommodate a new community, how are we going to do it in a way that people would really feel happy and be satisfied? And also at the same time, to take care of all these issues, not only about happiness, not only about employment, but also about, carbon emission, people's transportation, time they spend of going to school and so on and so forth. So we need to sit back and think about, what are some of those mental blocks in the old days, and if we really think that they are no longer suitable, get rid of them, and so that we can move forward to a new approach of conceiving a very different future for us.
Donald, what you said is entirely valid. I think in the past, in terms of developing new towns, basically it was population-led. Right? I mean, there's sometimes a mismatch between residential development and transport facilities, for example. But of course, our world, our society has changed. I remember until the 1990s, for example, when you redevelop some urban old public housing estates, you expect tenants, sorry, you have to move north to the new towns. They will give you more spacious units compared to what you have. But then eventually, because of public pressure, because of changing standards, expectations, then the rule seems to be you have to be relocated within the same urban area. Now that will confine the scope of whether you will actually go for redevelopment, because you have to look after existing tenants. Now this is just one example. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but expectations now are different. In terms of matching transport and development, when I was secretary, I pushed for the idea of parallel development. So transport should come together with housing. So by the time the housing development is completed, then you should have the relevant infrastructure in place. But of course, in reality, there's often a gap, which is unfortunate. But now the thinking seems to be even more advanced. You should build public transport first, and then gradually you move people. So transport waiting for people. Now, economically, that may not make sense. So, I mean, there are new perspectives, new demands, and for any government, you have to face that. So my view is, no matter how you reimagine, re-envision the future, and I totally agree with getting out of the box, trying not to be bound by previous assumptions, but still, at the end of the day, those tensions continue. And for government, you have to have a vision. You have to sell as good stories so that people will support whatever hard decision you have to persuade society to make.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but the answer to your question is we need a more imaginative and able government, right? But anyway, without going into that, there is an interesting question here, which of course touches on, is in fact Hong Kong all about, government priority has to do with national security. And basically the questioner says, well, forget everything else, all the things that you were discussing, Christine, Anthony, better sustainability, environment, you never get promoted. I mean, my own sense is, if you look at the mainland, maybe that gives you, or gives our government some idea. When I was in government, one of the things I worked on was on shipping and reducing emissions. And I did go to Beijing to meet the vice minister. We talked about, the idea, and he said, I'm very supportive, but what you have to do is actually, you need to go and talk to the transport people, right? Because they are responsible for shipping. So I went to knock on the door of the shipping people on the mainland. And actually talking to the people at the ministry, what was interesting was they said, well, in China, we now have targets, KPIs, that the transport people have to reduce emissions because we are responsible for ships and cars and everything else. So I think how you require, or how government requires government officials to set their KPIs is also important. Now, if Hong Kong has the idea that sustainability, which on the mainland is called 生態文明 today, right? This is now raised to a level of development philosophy in China. You all have to deliver. So that means all of you must take a certain baseline as your guidelines. Then I think thinking will be different. Now, of course, Anthony, I completely accept what you say, that even if you have all this, there's always going to be arguments about trade-offs. How fast, how much can we afford it, and who's going to object? But it will help to actually raise our qualitative markers to a level that we don't have today. So I think to answer this particular friend who's posed this question, national security is an issue, but actually so is everything else. And if we're talking about the physical structure of Hong Kong in terms of housing, the way we live, our transport, how to meet extreme climate, right, which we call climate adaptation, and making the city more resilient and so on. All these qualitative things have to be part of the city. And in fact, I think if we cannot do that, our people in Hong Kong will be less satisfied. And that isn't going to help national security.
True.
Yeah. Well, in fact, that's what I wanted to say in my presentation is the sort of guidelines, baselines, standards, and so on. So increasingly, you got to embed every single thing in the process of planning. And at the same time, what is really important is increasingly, I think ordinary people also have high expectations, right? I'm sure that in the coming summer, then people would say that, you got to have some guidelines and measures to tell me how to cope with heat. Whereas 10 years ago, of course, you would think, okay, this is a non-issue, but now it is an issue. It is also an issue that, how are you going to deal with extreme weather? In the old days, of course, we just throw our hands up and say, it's typhoon, not much we can do, and so on. Now, of course, we will say that, how ready we are able to cope with that
then
sort of thing.
You have to really come at people living in substandard housing, from another direction, because they will be experiencing the longer spells, not just one night, right, but many nights and they're right in the middle. Many of them are right in the center of the city, where it's even hotter because air circulation is less good. So how can you ask them to live in a place that may be 40 degrees? That's when physically our organs start to fall apart, right? So I think these are issues that we now have to face.
Earlier, Christine, you mentioned about your point about the Fanling case as a very desperate sort of solution. I fully agree with that. But the fact that somehow it seems that our community, our society has come to this point where this is the decisive issue.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you are able to use Fanling. I mean, that speaks volumes about the kind of complexity of the issue we are facing.
Right.
Again, about
the straw man, right? This is your straw man.
and why developers will only build much smaller units. Again, because we don't have land, we don't have space.
Yeah.
So how do we create space? I think that's the main issue. And of course, space has to do with land density or the kind of infrastructure that you have. And of course, the whether you have a resilient sort of living quality. I think all this will be part of this process for solutions. And I think I would fully agree that we need to revisit our planning standards.
Yeah,
what do we want to achieve?
I can just imagine, right? Somebody who might be watching our program might be saying something like this. Well, okay, the three of you talking about, higher level stuff and so on. Let's drill down to, okay, so Christine, if you are so clever, tell me where can I, put 1 million people, right?
Yeah.
So we're back down to the straw man. So I think this notion of the non-death of certain way of positioning some question drives us back down to this way of argument, right? To say, well, then you are so clever, Anthony, you solved the problem for me.
Well, I would not underestimate the pressure from, I mean, you're housing 1 million.
I agree.
I mean, you can't take that as just a straw man. It's not a straw man, it's a real issue.
No, it's a real issue, but I'm just afraid that if we keep going down the same argument, then we'll say, well, actually, sorry, let's just use a bit of the golf course and okay, smaller houses and so on. I mean, we're back down to those solutions. Now, you might say, is this an issue of time, right? Now, if we can't at some stage jump out of this hole, then that will be the same straw man going forward. So how can we take the straw man down, even if you might say, okay, short-term solution, sorry, we have to do this. We're not setting ourselves up for something longer term where we can have better discussion.
Yeah, and also I think one of the funny thing about policy discussion in Hong Kong is that we don't even bother to change some of our assumptions in some of these old debates. For example, I would say that 10 years down the road, for talents or professionals from mainland, if they need to enter Hong Kong, the sort of mobility we are referring to, would it be still the same that everyone have to queue up and wait for the immigration to put a job on certain things, something like that? Or rather that, it would be very fluid. Same thing for us to go into GBA. And with this sort of changing assumptions, then probably you think about, okay, we're handling another 1 million people, but spatially, time-wise, maybe a very different ball game. And if it turns out to be a different ball game, would you have a different projection? Or at least you would have option A, option B, and then that would be an entirely different picture than what way back to the same thing.
Somebody needs to think about these things in the policy making space, right? I mean, you and I can't solve the problem, but somebody as part of the system needs to have all these scenarios. But I'll give you one more example that I feel very strongly about. Our buildings ordinance is set in the 1970s, and it's been amended many times, many stickers and so on. But what actually we need in Hong Kong is a new piece of legislation that allows us to design, build, the kind of buildings that we want. So the question, and also in the past, right, the air pollution ordinance, it's again been amended many, many times. Question when I was in office was, do we actually need a new piece of legislation? So government colleagues always say, hou fan ah, you know, because to change your major piece of regulation is a lot of work. But there is this hesitation to do it. And actually, this is one of the key functions of government, right? To raise standards, to keep raising standards. We are not doing well enough in these areas. And because by doing it some other way, so for example, by encouraging better buildings, by giving GFA, right? Well, that doesn't set a new baseline. That just cures a few little things here and there for convenience. So I think this mindset again of the role of government, because only they can do certain things, like pass legislation with, LegCo. We are going to remain in a space where our level of legislation is not up to scratch when compared to Singapore and even the mainland.
I agree that some of our laws are behind the times. I think partly because, when I was in office, I can see that many civil service colleagues, they were so concerned, they were so worried about amending laws because of the legislative process, the very overly politicized process. So that's something we need to face. And I will also agree with what Dialogue said. I think into the future, our planning perimeters should not be confined to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong within the GBA. So that, we could consider other sort of factors that may affect how we plan the future. But still, because of one country, two systems, I think we cannot assume that Hong Kong will be entirely the same as the mainland in terms of mobility, in terms of flow of people, institutional arrangements. But still, I think that will give us perhaps a new way of thinking. For example, country parks. Of course, I agree with Christine that if you look at the real picture, some country park areas, you cannot use that for other things. But there are other areas which could perhaps be considered.
Yes, I'm just saying, show us what you're talking about.
And for country park areas, if we are talking about the whole of the GBA, Hong Kong part of GBA, then we do not expect Hong Kong people in the future just to visit the country park within Hong Kong. They may go to the mainland. So,
actually, we have nice country parks, which is why the mainlanders are coming to enjoy,
both ways.
So what I'm saying is, I've never touched the country parks. But when people say, well, why can't we use it? I want to know which are the potential areas and what is the mitigation, right? So if you're going to take this little bit, well, how about giving me those other bits? Then, because otherwise it's a zero-sum discussion.
All right. So thank you very much, Zoe, for interrupting. I feel so lucky that I'm here today to attend to this very fascinating discussion. And I'm sure that there are things that we could do regarding the environment, and with these very useful insights and very fascinating insights, I hope that all the participants will also feel feel like me, that we are very fortunate to have attend this dialogue series and learn from the insights of all the three speakers. So I would like to thank all of the speakers for sharing their views today and their time, and all the participants for attending this policy dialogue series. Please stay tuned for our future dialogues. We will continue to have more topics and speakers. So thank you very much, and thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.